What is RAM? RAM pulls files and programs from the hard drive so the computer can actively use them. That's it. It's the number of files and programs your computer can have open at one time. Whenever your computer loads something, it opens it in RAM. When you close it, it goes away from RAM. RAM really only has a lot to do with the speed of your computer if you're trying to do a lot of things at once. Once you have enough RAM to serve those files and apps you have open at one time, any more RAM on top of that is largely a complete waste. You can make an argument about future-proofing, get more RAM than you think you need so you don't have to upgrade, but in this area well, in my professional opinion, two things. Number one, yes, more is better, no argument there, but of all the things you pay for in a computer, RAM might be the smartest place to save your hard-earned money. It is, except in some laptops, so easy to upgrade. And number two, the future trend is actually that most common apps like web browsing and word processors are being optimized to use less RAM with each new update. Here's my description of the difference between amount of RAM in your computer with about 20 years of experience, boiled down to help give you some context for how much RAM you really need in a Windows environment. Windows 10 is typically far superior than past versions of Windows in managing memory, by the way. 1 gigabyte. Just don't. It may technically work in Windows 10 and earlier versions, but it's a waste of everyone's time. It's so slow to do even basic tasks, but it will run. 2 gigabytes. I've used systems with only 2 gigabytes of RAM. They do work. You may have to wait a few extra seconds to load anything because it has to close everything else that had it open before, but it will run once it's loaded up. Anything more than 2 to 3 tabs in a Word document though, or more than one YouTube video, and you'll start to be really aggravated because it will be molasses. Windows 10 is actually smart enough to turn off some of its RAM usage when you load a game though, and I've gotten a surprising amount of games to work just great with 2 gigabytes of RAM. 3 gigabytes. Here is where, if I had to, I could use a computer on a regular basis with this amount of RAM. Apps load fast, you can have 5 to 6 documents and 5 to 6 tabs open at the same time, enough for decent multitasking, and as long as you carefully watch how many things you have open, you can do a surprisingly large amount of stuff, including streaming Netflix at the highest resolutions, and over 50% of all games on Steam will actually load fine with only 3 gigabytes of RAM. 4 gigabytes. This is the first tier of what I would call a solid good computer. 4 gigabytes is enough for 10 to 20 tabs, plus 10 to 20 Office documents at the same time. Photoshop runs great, even most video editing programs run great, as long as you're not doing anything super complicated. When you start to edit a lot of layers at once, then it starts to slow down. They still make brand new $500 laptops that only come with 4 gigabytes of RAM. Why? Because the vast majority of users only really ever use up to 4 gigabytes of RAM at most. 90% of Steam games will run with just 4 gigabytes of RAM if you close all the other apps before you launch it. 6 gigabytes. This is, right now, the safety zone for the average user. Most of the time you won't ever go past 4 gigabytes, but it's smart to have a little cushion for the few times that you might. There are very, very few games that truly require more than 6 gigs of RAM. Game developers routinely exaggerate system requirements, and this is one area that they overstate to cover themselves. You can open dozens upon dozens of apps and tabs, plus multiple videos with no slowdown. You can even do advanced editing with great performance. 8 gigabytes. This is more than enough for average users and will run any game, including moderate to heavy photo and video editing and an abundance of simultaneous apps and tabs. There's only 3 common reasons to ever get a computer with more than 8 gigabytes of RAM. Number 1, you're a tab fiend. You routinely, and I do mean all the time, have open more than 70 tabs at once that you just can never bring yourself to close, especially if you use Google Chrome. Every other browser uses far less RAM. Also, there's a ton of tab management extensions out there I can recommend. Number 2, you're a heavy video and Photoshop editor. We're talking total pro that either works in high fidelity 4K or has multiple projects open at once that each have multiple simultaneous layers, more than 6, open at once and again on a regular basis. Number 3, some other specialty need like database management, a specialty program your industry requires, like when I built an advanced dental scanning computer for a program called Sidexis or simulcasting. Gaming doesn't make the cut. If you compare even the latest cutting edge games with 8 gigabytes versus 16 gigabytes of RAM, There's virtually no difference, maybe a few percentage points at most. 16 gigabytes is almost totally wasting your money. Businesses are happy to sell that much to you, but you really should think twice. Committed to your success, Kendall.